Good evening, everyone. My name is Bob Perez, and I'm the director of the USM Center for Human Rights and Civil Liberties. And I want to welcome everyone to this very special occasion. Dr. Kevin Bales is one of the world's foremost authorities on human slavery, which has become one of the world's largest and most profitable illegal industries. It happens also in Mississippi and even in Hattiesburg. The talk is sponsored by the USM Center for Human Rights and Civil Liberties, which is part of the School of Science, Social Science, and Global Studies. You can find it on the center on Facebook, Twitter, and on a webpage. It's a nonpartisan, non-religious initiative at USM to bring attention to human rights abuses locally and globally, and highlight solutions. This is a preview of a conference that will be held on human trafficking at this campus in April. We hope you participate and consider perhaps presenting at that conference if that research topic is of interest to you, and other human rights topics are acceptable too. There are a few key people to thank for making this talk possible, and first is Professor Bales. He is currently briefly visiting Tougaloo College in Jackson, but generously agreed to come down and talk with us tonight. Second, the co-sponsors, including the College of Arts and Sciences, the Honors College, and the University Forum. Also, the three current student interns of the Center for Human Rights who did the publicity for this event: Lindsay Hargrave, Megan Zuley, Lily Bush, and also Tamara Lones, who helped too. And next, the USM technical staff, including Lee Chambers, Will, Kevin Sellers, and Russ Rawson. Finally, you for coming. Dr. Andrew Haley, who directs the University Forum, will introduce Dr. Bales. Dr. Bales.
Hi, my name is Andrew Haley, and I am grateful to have this opportunity to speak about Professor Kevin Bales. I teach history. Studying history can help us to learn a lot about ourselves and our world, and such knowledge can be humbling, but not always. Since the Enlightenment, those in the West, in Europe, and the United States, have often mistakenly assumed that history was progressive. In other words, they believed that the past was bad and the future would be better. This view of the world can be dangerous. It can lead us to conclude that all of the tyrants lost their heads in the French Revolution, that poverty was vanquished by the rise of the welfare state, that anti-Semitism was defeated with the Allied victory in World War II, and most relevant to today's lecture, that slavery was ended when the British learned to sing Amazing Grace and Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Kevin Bales sets the record straight. He knows that the end of slavery is a historical myth because he has gone undercover and has met the slavers and their victims. Through his writing, he demands that we no longer avert our eyes. He asks us to look. And for that, we owe him a great debt. In his Pulitzer-nominated book, Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, Kevin Bales demonstrates that ownership is not necessary for slavery to thrive in a global economy where consumer goods and services are inexpensive, labor laws are non-existent, and people are cheap. Disposable People was made into a movie that Professor Bales co-wrote, in which won a Peabody and 2 Emmy Awards. Since then, he has written numerous other indictments of slavery, including Ending Slavery, which won the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Promoting World Order, The Slave Next Door, co-written with Ron Sodalter, which explores slavery in the United States, and most recently, Blood and Earth, a truly unprecedented work that explores the links between modern slavery and global climate change. Bales is an esteemed academic and also a respected activist. He is co-founder of Free the Slaves, a Washington, D.C. think tank organization that is the U.S. sister organization of Anti-Slavery International, the world's oldest human rights group. He is the principal investigator for Anti-Slavery Usable Paths. He serves on the expert working group of the Global Slavery Index and is on the board of directors of the Freedom Fund. His team at the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation won the Queen's Anniversary Prize in 2016. Bales himself was named as the originator of one of 100 world-changing discoveries by the Association of British Universities, and as a visionary who is changing the world by the Utne Reader. Other awards include the Human Rights Award of the University of Alberta, the Judith Sargent Murray Award for Human Rights, and the Laura Smith Davenport Human Rights Award. Perhaps most significantly, Kevin Bales now directs the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. It is a really, truly unique and unprecedented academic effort to identify causes, effects, and solutions to the slavery crisis. When I am not teaching history, I am the director of the University Forum. And it is in that capacity that I'm most glad that Forum was able to come together with the Center for Human Rights and Civil Liberties and the College of Arts and Sciences to bring Kevin Bales to Southern Miss. I wish to thank Dr. Bob Press for spearheading this effort and the Office of the President and the Honors College for supporting the University Forum. Now, please join me in welcoming to Southern Miss Kevin Bales, Professor of Contemporary Slavery and Director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, and a companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George.
That was much too long.
It was too long.
Yeah, it was much too long.
Well,
yeah. You hear all that and you think, no, I just put my trousers on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. I want to be clear about that. Hi, I'm really glad to be here. I've been having a great time since I got here. Was with a wonderful class earlier. They were just cheeky and a little daunted, and I thought that was great. And we kicked around a lot of interesting stuff. And it's a treat to be here. I don't even think I've even been on this campus before, even though I've lived in Mississippi in my life, off and on a couple of times, but always in North Mississippi. So, hey y'all, great to be here. I'll come back, don't worry. Now, I know, it's odd. You expect this English accent, right? But my grandfather was actually born into a sharecropper family up in Lafayette County. So it all kind of rolls together in a funny way. What I'm going to talk about, this sounds a little loud, doesn't it? Or is it okay out here? All right, fine. What I want to talk about is not your normal slavery talk. I'm afraid that so often when people want to talk about contemporary slavery, they tell this story usually about poor Maria, and she's a pathetic victim, and it's a really terrible thing, and we're all supposed to feel really sad about it, and then we are supposed to get turned into white saviors, and we're going to go rescue people, and it's this sort of sensationalist, non-logical thing about the big problem of modern slavery. But the truth of the matter is that in this slavery movement, this anti-slavery movement of the 21st century, we're actually making progress. We're making very important progress. And a lot of that progress that we're making has to do with how we're taking it apart using scientific methods. And so this is actually a story about breakthroughs, about scientific and other breakthroughs that help us to bring slavery, we believe, to an end. So we're going to unlock this science of slavery. This one isn't my normal first slide, but I popped this up because if you'll notice the date line, it was just last Wednesday. Last Wednesday, this popped up in the news because part of my team, part of several other teams, part of the United Nations, part of the U.S. government, part of the International Labor Organization, all came together and made an agreement to bring all of their data together in order to combat slavery. So they were going to share data at the global level across national borders in order to address slavery. I know that sounds boring on one hand. It's like, oh, good, governments are going to share data with each other. But I don't know if you understand how rare that is. It's almost impossible to get governments to share data. And the work I've done in this country, trying to get Homeland Security to share data with Health and Human Services, with housing, has always collapsed. They've never agreed to share their data inside the U.S. government. Even doing work in Central Florida with the state of Florida, they wouldn't share their data. So the idea that globally we've had a breakthrough like this, it's just, I was very excited to find this. I'd already left England when this popped up. Now, first thing though, if you're not familiar with the reality of slavery today, I want to show you a picture of it. So this is slavery today. 40.3 million slaves in the world today is our best estimate, conservative estimate at this moment. And you'll see that there are different colors here, and you can see that the darker colors are the higher prevalence. So this isn't about raw numbers. It's actually a measure of what is the proportion of a country's population that's in slavery. So if you look at someplace like, well, you can see that little black dot in the Caribbean, that's Haiti. We're pretty sure that the proportion of the Haitian population that's enslaved is between 2% of the population and 3% of the population. Or if you look at Northwest Africa, the darkest color is Mauritania. We think that the population, the proportion of the Mauritanian population that's in slavery is somewhere between 5% and 6%. And that's probably the highest proportion of any country in the world, about 5%. So it's important first to get notice that we don't live in a world like the world of the past, like the Deep South, which was once 30% slavery or 40% slavery in some counties. And in some counties of the Mississippi Delta, it was 90% slaves in some of the Delta counties. We don't live in Viking society, which was 20% slaves. We don't live in Roman society, which was 23% slaves. We live in a world where even the worst countries in terms of prevalence have a very low fraction of their population. And other countries, when you start talking about Norway or Western Europe or the United States, we're way down below 1%. I mean, a 0.002% of the population of most of the rich countries are in slavery. So we're interested, but at the same time that I say that, and it sounds like I'm trying to make little of slavery, I also want you to notice there are no blanks on this map. There are no blank countries. Everywhere we look, there's slavery. Everywhere we look, we find slavery. Every country that we've looked at. I mean, there are a couple of tiny little island nations like Tuvalu and little tiny Pacific nations that we haven't found anything, but we also it's very hard to tell with these tiny little places. But in any of the regular countries in the world of any size, more than 100,000 or so people, we find slavery. Now, I want to start from there and, in a sense, introduce you to a series of things that we really consider breakthroughs about slavery today. Now, the first one is about the economics of slavery. And it's because, obviously, for most of human history, having slaves has been an economic activity. Now, that's even the case when money hadn't even been invented, because slavery actually predates the invention of money, in the same way that it predates in human history the invention of law. But the most important thing to understand about slavery in the past, in terms of the economics, is that slaves have always been expensive. They've always been expensive. And today, all of that has changed. And it's changed in the last 50 years. There's been a collapse in the number of people in slavery, and that's led to some new things about slavery. So these lads, turn that down a little bit. These lads are perfect examples of disposable, cheap slaves. These boys live in Nepal. They were lured away from their families. Their parents were told that they would be given jobs. Parents were told that they could be bringing home money to the family. But of course, once they were removed from the family, they were taken off someplace else completely, and they were put to work as beasts of burden. They're like little donkeys. They carry big stones on their back. The cost of taking that child from their parents was around $10. The people who lured them away said, we'll give you an advance on their wages. They were never going to get wages, but we're going to give you an advance on their wages, and the advance is about $10. And that's what it costs to remove the children from the family, and whatever it costs to take them to wherever they were going to actually steal them away to exploit. What happens when you glut a world with a large number of enslavable people? What's the rule of supply and demand? When you expand the supply, the price drops. And these kids, as you can see, cost $10. They're so inexpensive that if they stumble and fall with these rocks on their back down into a ravine, the slaveholder goes down and picks up the rock but leaves the kid, because the stone, the paving stone, because it's more expensive to get medical care for the child than it is to just go and get a new child. What does this look like? Okay, I'm allowed 3 of these because I'm a nerd. I have a nerd chart allocation. This is a chart that actually shows the price of slaves over the last 4,000 years. And it shows what happens when you glut the world economy and the global population with enslavable people. The key thing is that over the years, most people in slavery, average slaves, cost something like $40,000 to $50,000 in today's money. But today, that price has collapsed on average across the world down to about 90 as the average. $10 for those boys in Nepal. If you wanted to buy a person in slavery in this country, you'd be paying low thousands of dollars. But the average across the planet is about 90. One more example, reaching back into the history of Mississippi. If you wanted to buy an average slave, say in New Orleans or in Natchez in 1850, you'd go to the slave market and you'd say, I want a field hand. I want a 19-year-old guy who can chop cotton. I don't need anything special, just a 19-year-old field hand worker. What was the price of a field hand? We know this really well because the slave markets kept records, insurance companies kept records. So we know that the average price of an average slave, which was a 19-year-old agricultural worker in 1850, was between $1,000 and $1,200, $1,850. What else could you buy in 1850 for $1,200? A 4-bedroom house, 500 to 600 acres of land, or 6 to 8 oxen. And when I say oxen, think tractor, right? This is pre-tractor, so think tractors, right? $1,200 in 1850 would be the equivalent of somewhere between $50,000 and $55,000 today. Slaves in the past were expensive. But when something that's happened in my lifetime happened, the population explosion, you can see the population is the red line, that about the time just before I was born, in fact, that line suddenly turned straight for the ceiling. And we've gone, in my lifetime, from 2.5 billion people on the planet to 7.6 billion people on the planet. Now, it took us all of human history to reach 2.5 billion, and then it's taken my lifetime to reach 7.6 billion. And we're headed for 10, definitely for 10. Now that's probably the most dramatic thing that's ever happened to this planet, leaving aside slavery, leaving aside almost everything else. It's the fundamental root behind climate change. It's the fundamental root behind species loss. It's the fundamental root behind advanced and high levels of migration. It's the fundamental root behind a lot of global conflict. That complete, dramatic, unprecedented, phenomenal, one time in history, surprise shot for the moon of our global population has changed a lot of different things, and it's absolutely changed the fact that people now are so expensive and disposable. That's why I called that first book I wrote Disposable People, because when I was in the field, I began to realize something was very, very different about the slavery of today. Everything was the same with slavery of the past: brutal, property treated, cruel, exploitation, all that stayed the same, but the price had completely collapsed. But we're starting to find ways to break through that too, to have breakthroughs to get through that. One of them is that we're really getting good at seeing slavery from space. Now, I'll take you through a couple of things. First, here's a satellite picture of an area of Bangladesh. Now, this particular area of Bangladesh is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That means, like Yellowstone National Park, no one should be cutting the trees in this space. This is called the Sundarbans Forest, the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site Forest. Why is it so important? Why is it so protected? Because it's the largest mangrove forest in Asia. It's also the largest carbon sink in all of Asia. You know what a carbon sink is? It's that place on the planet where instead of CO2 going into the air, there's so many great trees that it sucks CO2 out of the air. So instead of having global warming increasing, it's actually sucking the CO2 out of the air, so it makes the world better. So we want places like the Sunderbans forest to suck the CO2 out of the air. But look, something you can see where the mangrove forest is on the right, but something else is going on here on the left. It sort of looks like buildings, but it's not. What you're seeing there, those strange rectangular structures, are in fact fish drying racks, serviced completely by child slaves. So little boys, almost entirely, are working there in large numbers, brought there by criminals, in the same way that those Nepali boys were stolen away from their families. These are recruited in exactly the same way, brought down the river and put onto these small protected islands where there's not supposed to be anything, certainly no human stuff. And as you can see, they're cutting and drying and fish like crazy. And notice as well, some of the racks are the size of these boys. And then look in the back. You can see there's some racks that are much higher. They go up much higher into the up several layers. I wanted you to just understand that because if you look at this picture, an amazing picture of a modern slave driver beating children to make them go faster on the drying racks, a way to get them going. And these kids are in terrible shape because they have to work as long as the fish come in from the boats. They work. It can be 24 hours. It can be 48 hours. They get tired. They get hurt. They fall off the thing, but they're beaten to keep them going quickly. They work there all the time, sitting in the gut, fish guts. They get very little to eat. Sometimes they're sexually assaulted. When I had a chance to talk to 4 of these boys who had escaped from that island the night before, I met them in the morning after they had escaped. I spoke to them all separately, and one of the things that I asked them was this: what were your health problems? I heard a lot about a lot of the things I just explained to you, but I said, what about health problems? What were your challenges in the fish camp? And they all separately said, well, the main problem was diarrhea. They didn't have any other name for it. They just said, it was diarrhea. But we had diarrhea all the time. We couldn't control it. I think it's because they were eating fish guts and they were around fish guts. But they said they all knew other children who had been there and who had died of diarrhea while they were there. But then I asked them a question that I have to say their answers kind of rocked my world, kind of blew my mind. I said, what was the second main health problem you had? And every child individually and separately told me that they had witnessed or knew another child who had been eaten by a tiger. Now, that's a tiger eating a deer, not a boy. But the point is that this is a classic example of how slavery and environmental destruction have gone together to create horrific problems that you would have never been able to guess. Why is the Sundarbans a protected area? Yes, it's a carbon sink. Yes, it's an amazing ecosystem. And yes, it's also the last breeding grounds of the Bengal tigers, which are a protected species, an amazing animal. And what happens when you destroy their forest and you drive away the deer that they eat and you insert little boys into the space? Who becomes the prey animal? And in a sense, the tiger's just defending and trying to live their life as they should do in their protected forests. But the slaveholders don't care. The slaveholders don't care about destroying the environment, and the slaveholders don't care about destroying the lives of the children either. All of that, I know, you're thinking, what's this got to do with satellites? Well, the first thing that we did, I just need to point out, if you're wondering where all that fish goes, cat food. Cat food often that comes here, as well as to Western Europe. Who has a cat? Yeah, I know. This cat, you can tell by the guilty look on his face that I had just told him about where it comes from, and he's like, oh. But luckily, being a cat, he finished with his regret in about 1/10 of a second, because cats are the epitome of indifference, and then he was like, I don't care. Just feed me some words. Yeah, and shrimp. They also work in shrimp farms, and that's the frozen shrimp that you buy. When you buy frozen shrimp, it can often be from that same location. Why am I telling you all about this and saying about satellites? Because the very first piece of work that we did, where we said we think we might be able to, having been there in Sunderbans with those guys in those camps, working around tigers, etc., I began to realize this is so big we could see this from space. So when I got back to my university, I went to the Geospatial Institute where all the space people are. They're both spaced out and space people. I said, could we try this? And they were like, we don't do human. How do you see human rights from space? But I convinced them to take a pilot. And the pilot project was this. We began to look at the Sunderbans UNESCO World Heritage Site. And we began to see, as it says, the camps. And we could count the camps. And we found camps that no one knew about. And we found places where they had been in the past with the satellites and then moved to new locations. And we demonstrated in about a 2-month project that you could do it, and we moved straight on to stage 2. We started looking at brick kilns. We'd actually found all the slave camps in the UNESCO World Heritage Site and informed the government and so forth. Not much has happened yet, but we're still pushing that along. Then we started working at brick kilns. Brick kilns stretch all the way across southern Pakistan, southern Nepal, and northern India, all the way from one end of the side to the other, all the way to China. They're very often have slavery. They don't all have slavery, but the majority probably that we can find have slavery. But I say if we can find them. But the thing is, we began to approach crowdsourcing, citizen science, to help us find all the brick kilns where slavery could be happening. Who did all the work? Students. Not that we required it, but there's a website called Zooniverse, which scientists use to ask the public to help them find things when they're dealing with something like galaxies, right? One of the first uses of Zooniverse was to get people to find galaxies in outer space by looking at space photos. We asked people who are mostly students who do this to help us find brick kilns so that we could locate where there would be likely cases of slavery. So you go into Zooniverse, those are brick kilns that somebody's drawn, put the little marker on, you can see the green bits, and it trains you to identify what a brick kiln looks like from space. And then we begin to get lots of news coverage because the journalists love this scientific stuff. And we were showing how you could find them and you could do it. But what even the people who were doing the work didn't understand necessarily was that every time they marked one of these brick kilns with their special pointer, behind the image, written into the software, was machine learning. So the students were training what you could call an artificial intelligence. It's a bit of a stretch to call that an artificial intelligence, but certainly it was a learning machine. Every time the student did it, it was teaching the computer behind it how to better recognize itself. What's the personal pronoun for itself? Yeah, okay, it's like him or her computer self, right? Anyway, the machine was learning from the students. The machine figured out or got enough learning from the students that suddenly the machine understood exactly how to find all the brick kilns, and suddenly the job that was going to take like 30 years to achieve with citizen science crowdsourcing was finished in about 2 hours because the machine behind it learned to do it at lightning computer speed. So every one of these dots, these tiny yellow dots, which I appreciate looks like snow or something, but every one of those dots is a brick kiln. It found every brick kiln in Pakistan, Nepal, India, and all the way over into Bangladesh, and all over parts of India. Does that stop slavery? No. Does it tell us where the slavery is? Yes. No one knew how many brick kilns there were. Nobody knew where they all were. And now we're able to say, because we can zoom in and say, in your district, there are this many kilns. If you want to go out and check them out, have a go, right? We can begin to pinpoint it, and we can work through it systematically. We then begin to do other things with satellite information, like layering it with other types of information, like satellites plus on the ground plus time series, and then even criminological data, like how many slavery cases and how many murders. Now, this is another forest, and another forest like the Sunderbans, where something's wrong in this picture. There's a little light on here, but you can basically see it's all trees on the left, but all the trees have been cut on the right. And then right in the middle, there's something that looks like a whole bunch of like ping pong balls or something, right? Dirty ping pong. But remember, we're from space. So those are something about this big, and there's smoke coming out of them. We're thinking, what? Huh? It's a charcoal camp. It's a place where slave labor is used to illegally cut down protected national forests in Brazil, feed them into clay ovens, those are those bumps that you saw, and burn them under controlled conditions to turn the wood into charcoal. And this chap who's actually enslaved is carrying a giant can of charcoal up to throw in the back of a truck so that it can be taken off, not for a barbecue. This is not charcoal for barbecue. This is charcoal to be used by the Brazilian steel industry, because they don't have coke and coal in Brazil, but they have huge forests. So for 30, 40 years now, they've been burning wood to make charcoal to feed the steel industry, which in some ways, if you have any respect for trees at all, is kind of insane. Where does all that steel go? So the bottom of the chair, right, is that metal? Is that metal? That's almost certainly Brazilian steel that you're sitting on from this slave laborer. Sheet steel, rolled steel, is exported from Brazil to the United States for exactly that kind of purpose, putting the thin steel bottoms on the seats that you're on. So you're all slightly complicit at the moment. When we begin to layer up that data, we get pictures like this. This is a funny map, so I have to explain it. I'm sorry. This is my second nerd, right? I'm allowed like 2, 3 things that are kind of nerdy. The purpley bit at the top that looks like a river is the Amazon River. The green parts of this map are Amazon forests that are protected and should never, ever be cut. So the green parts are uncut, protected Amazon forests. The yellow parts are protected Amazon forests that should never be cut, that has been cut. In other words, all the yellow parts of this map, which covers thousands of miles, are in fact illegally destroyed, protected Amazon forests. Then notice the lines that we put on to show how the scythe, the great scythe of destruction, murder, and slavery has moved in closer to the Amazon over a 15-year period. Notice the areas like just inside the inner ring where there's a circle of red dots and a big blue dot, where a criminal gang has pushed into the protected forest and clear-cut a yellow circle of destroying precious habitat in the protected Amazon. The big blue dot means there's at least 50 people have been enslaved there that we know about, and the 12 red dots around it is that there were at least 12 murders there that we know about in that one time period. Now, we also know that all these dots of slavery and murder are a great undercount, because all the time, and this is an example, is the last time I was in Brazil, I went out with CSI Amazonia, and we were digging up the graves, the hidden graves of slaves who had been assassinated after they were useless and buried in the forest. So you can't see that very well with this light, but there's a bullet hole right here and an exit wound here, because the slaveholder was simply executing the slaves that he'd worked almost to death, and he didn't want there to be witnesses, so he put them in the forest after they cut the forest. They put them in, buried them in the cut forest. The murders are rife, and I'm afraid it's going to be worse under the new president. Where does all that steel go? The seats you're on, the cars you drive. Plumbing fixtures are one of the key uses of Brazilian steel and iron. in the United States. So the main companies that you buy plumbing fixtures. So you touch this stuff every day. We also begin to link slavery, as you've already guessed, to other things like climate change. You know, I've shown you two places where protected forests, which are crucial to to maintaining the control of climate change and reducing the chance of global warming, are being destroyed, and the chances of global warming increased by slavery activity and slavery crime. But as an example, to go a bit further, so here's the Xingu River in another part of Brazil. This particular photo was taken out the window of a space capsule by an astronaut with a camera. I mean, literally with a home camera. But it just shows that, again, an area this isn't protected as a forest. This is the indigenous peoples, Indian tribes, are supposed to be the only people in this land. They don't burn their own forests. But you can see that it's forests all up and down. And this is so high. We're talking about quite a few hundred miles across. Here's how it boils down to a factoid, though. I know this. You're saying, okay, you're showing me here, you're showing me there. What does this all mean when we add it together? Well, if slavery were a country, imagine that the 40.3 million people in slavery were actually all in one country. What would it be like? Well, for one thing, 40.3 million people is the population of Algeria, and it's not quite, but it's around the population of California. So it would be a smaller place. It wouldn't be a huge country like America. It would be a small country of 40 million people. The United Nations says that slavery generates about $150 billion a year into the global economy from this criminal activity. 150 billion. But if that was the GDP, the gross domestic product, the output of the country of slavery, that would put it in the same rank as Bulgaria or the state of Kansas. Is there anyone here from Kansas who can explain to me what on earth is going on in Kansas that's worth 150 billion? I've always been boggled by this, but if you look in Wikipedia and say, what's the GDP of each American state? It says Kansas has 150 billion. I grew up near Kansas. I didn't think it was worth much of nothing. But the point was that if slavery were a country, it would be a small, poor country. Got it? But if slavery were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 into the atmosphere after China and the United States. China is the largest emitter of CO2 on the planet. The United States is the second largest emitter of CO2 on the planet. Slavery would be the third largest after that, larger than any other individual country. It's not as big as all of Europe together. If you put all of Europe together into a country, which we're now breaking up very quickly, but if you put it together, it would be a little higher than slavery. But slavery would be the third largest. Now, wait a minute. 40 million people, a tiny, poor country, and it's putting out more CO2 than any other country except China and the United States? This is what I'm talking about, linking these things together. Why is that important if we're going to try to get rid of slavery? Well, because that's a vicious cycle. Slaves are used to destroy the environment and cut forests, which leads to more CO2, which pushes poor people out of the forest and into vulnerability, which means they can be enslaved, and they're enslaved to destroy more of the environment, which then creates more CO2. See where we're going with that? That's a vicious cycle. But the point now is once you understand that there's a vicious cycle between slavery and environmental destruction, you can imagine the virtuous circle. Slaves are set free. Slaves are allowed to work or ask if they'd like to work, replanting the forest they've destroyed, decreasing the amount of CO2, building the livelihoods, creating gardens, creating forests, leading to more freedom for more slaves, and it goes around and around. Right? You could reverse, if we were able to, here's the nutty thing, if we were able to somehow stop slavery right away, and especially stop the slavery in environment that's linked to environmental destruction, we would probably stop the rise in CO2 in the atmosphere. which means that worry that we have about it reaching 2 and 3 degrees centigrade heat increase in temperature would stop as well. If we were able to do it enough and keep it going and do other things, we could actually begin to reduce the amount of CO2 in the air. Maybe even down to 350 parts per million, which is the stable state that the planet's been at for thousands of years that we've now jumped past. You could possibly stop global warming by stopping slavery. Could you stop slavery by stopping global warming? Maybe not, but it would help. It would help because people wouldn't be so vulnerable. I'm going to jump a whole difference here into a different sort of place. So we're not looking out, we're not looking from space, we're looking into people's minds. Corpus linguistics is the use of very powerful computers to analyze text. Not little text like a single poem or two, but texts where you can say all the issues of the New York Times forever, all the books that's in the library, millions and millions of words. You can use these specific programs of analyzing the corpus of a linguistic product. We've been doing that with slave narratives. Now, this isn't corpus linguistics. This is one of those word clouds that you can do on the web. But in a way, I put this up just as an indicator. You know, who's generated a word cloud? Oh no, come on, you guys are college students. Really? I'm the only person in the room who's thank you. Brother. I couldn't even see if you, yeah, thank you, brother. Yeah, word cloud. You just put, you like take a big chunk of text, you put it into the word cloud generator on the web, and you've all seen these, right? It's like, what's the main words that come through this particular text and so forth. I put about 40,000 words, so not really a good example, but I put about 40,000 words from 5 different narratives from the voices of people in slavery into my word cloud generator, and it gave me this. And you can see a few things in there that kind of make sense, like Nuba. That's actually because one of the people was a Nuba woman who had been caught up in slavery. And you have people talking about being frightened and changing. I never dreamed that the key word that would come out of all these slaves' voices would be thought. And I still don't quite understand why that is. I need to go back and think about that. But that's just a word cloud. Corpus linguistics does something else. It allows us to see into people's minds in large groups. You bring what happens, right, when we bring this data analytics, this corpus linguistics, to the million words of slavery narratives. We've just been breaking through on this, and here's a couple of the results. If, for example, you look at all the survivor narratives that we have, and we have more than 1,000 now in our digital files that we can bring to bear with this way. One of the things that the corpus linguistics tells us is slaves, people who have been in slavery, almost never use the future tense. It's like they can't. Like they can't think ahead. Something's happened. And if they do use the future tense, suddenly they back up and go to the past tense, like abruptly. It's as if the future is harsh on them. Sudden past tense. Now we've learned that from corpus linguistics. Now you take the survivors who are scholars, because we have a whole group of survivor scholars at our university who tell us the truth about what it's like to be in slavery. And one of the things that they've said that's backed up by this corpus linguistics, that's been coming out over and over again, is that if you are in slavery, one thing that happens is that you become, in a sense, removed from time. You live in an eternal present. You do not have a future that you even hold in your mind in any way. That's very hard for us as people who have always had a past, always had a future, always had a present. It's hard to even think that way. But to stop thinking completely about the future and to stop thinking about the past. Why? Because if you start thinking, if you're under the control of a slaveholder and you think or say anything about a future, you're hurt, you're harmed. The slaveholder doesn't want you to have a future. Your only future is their will. And their will is that you live in the present moment. They don't want you to have a past that you look back to and wish for. They want you to wish to help them and serve them and live in the present moment. People who have been in slavery have said to me, you stop having a future because having a future, talking or thinking about it leads to being hurt, pain. If you start looking back, not only do you feel emotional pain, but if you say much about it, you're hurt by the slaveholder. You learn to be in the exact present all the time of enslavement. It's the least painful place to be. And the aspatiality, which is a kind of a funny word, is basically the same thing. You stop thinking you can move around. You stop thinking you can get up and go forward or backward, because doing that causes pain. That links to the findings of the corpus linguistics. Now, why is this important? This is fascinating about the psychology of actually being in slavery. Why is this important for us? And why is it important if we're making an anti-slavery movement? Because the legal definitions that the police use, that the doctors use, that the social workers use to define the nature of slavery don't include any of this. When people are trying to figure out how do we help people who have come out of slavery, how do we understand what the crime of slavery is about, how can we truly tell if a person has been in slavery and what we should help with, how we should work with them, we don't have any of this knowledge. Who wrote those legal definitions? Old white men. That's who always writes legal definitions for all of human history, right? I've been around while they're doing it. And it's just, they may be well-meaning, but they don't know anything about slavery. They're inventing it. They're imagining it. And they think because they're smart and powerful, they can imagine anything. They can't. They can't imagine the feelings of a person in slavery. Most of them can't even imagine the feelings of a woman. Even a little. Maybe a little. The nice one. But the point is, once we understand what slavery really is, as it's lived by the people who have been in it, we can really begin to understand how to address it and also how to help people past it. Now I'm going to jump from what we've just been doing to where we're going next. And this follows on perfectly, because one of the things that we know about trauma is that it leaves terrible psychological problems, but it also leaves physical traces on the brains of the people who've been traumatized. There's been research on Holocaust victims where they've used MRI like this, magnetic resonance imaging. They've used MRI to look at the brains of Holocaust victims. They've looked at the brains of Romanian orphans who have been terribly treated. And they see changes in their brains, in physical changes in their brains, which can be addressed if you know what the physical change is. I don't mean you have to go in and operate, but it actually allows you to think to find, for example, the correct pharmaceutical and therapeutic responses to different types of brain change. That's never been done for people in slavery. Here we've had slavery with us for 5,000-6,000 years, and we've never tried to understand what it does to the brain of a person enslaved. 40 million people with brain changes, and we have no clue what they are. Likewise, there's something called epigenetics. It's not about changing your genes or your chromosomes, but one of the things that we know is that trauma can change the way your chromosomes and genes express themselves. I know that sounds a bit odd. So it doesn't actually alter your genetics, but it changes the way they work. So that, for example, people who have been in trauma will often, if their pituitary gland is regulated by a particular chromosome, it'll alter the way that's happened, and it'll change the way the pituitary gland, and not for the good, is then altered from the trauma. We don't know what the epigenetic impact of slavery is. We will know more soon. We've just got saliva samples from 600 child soldiers in the Congo that we've shifted up to the epigenetic lab in Germany. So we're going to know something soon. But all of this is areas where we know it can be useful and make a difference, but we're just on this. Why it's a coming soon. We're going to start spending more time looking at people who actually are in favor of slavery. In the class earlier, that I was with, somebody asked about, what about ISIS? What about Islamic State? You know, how is it they do slavery and why do they do it? Well, what's interesting about ISIS, and I don't recommend that you go online to read their online English language magazine, but ISIS publishes an online English magazine called Dabiq, and you can see this article, The Revival of Slavery Before the Hour. And it's an article in which the leaders of ISIS, of the Islamic State, explain why they believe God has given them the right to enslave certain people. Now, they have a very twisted, sick notion of Islam, right? They really have a crazy notion of Islam. And don't think this is just about Islam, because there's the Lord's Resistance Army in Sudan and northern Uganda, which has a crazy, twisted notion of Christianity and uses it to allow people to enslave others. The Trokosi peoples in Ghana use an animist religion that's crazy and twisted and sick to enslave people there. Religion has been used throughout human history as one of the reasons why you are allowed to enslave people. But we need to understand, if we're going to fight against and work with and find a way out of slavery, we need to understand the ideas of the people who are in favor of slavery. It's not good enough just to say they are evil. That doesn't usually get you anywhere. You don't understand people if you simply have labeled them as pure evil, because they see you as pure evil. ISIS sees us as pure evil. I don't think they try to understand us. But if we understand them better, we'll find better ways to deal with the slavery that they commit. We're trying to understand the role of slavery in the Anthropocene. For whom is this a familiar concept, the Anthropocene? Right on, sister. Right down here. A few people. The Anthropocene is something that truly exists and doesn't yet exist. And what I mean by that is that, you know, we've all heard of the epochs of the world's existence. Everybody knows about the epoch called the Jurassic. Why? Because we all went to that park, right? We all went to Jurassic Park. We had a really good time, scared the diddle out of us, and so forth. We all learned about dinosaurs when we were 9 years old, about the Cretaceous period, right? We know those periods. Which one do we live in now? See, we all know about the dinosaurs. What's the name of the one right now? Yeah, Eocene. And that's the one that's been going on for like 50,000, 60,000 years, I think, if I got that right. But here's the point. All over the world, there are environmental scientists, but especially geologists and geographers and others in a world congress who are saying, we actually have to change the name of our epoch, because that epoch is really over, because we live in an epoch which the main things that's changing our world is not volcanoes or an asteroid that kills the dinosaurs. It's us. It's anthropos. It's people. We live in a world where the most dramatic changes that are occurring to the planet are all caused by people. It's the Anthropocene. And you can see one of the reasons why they make this argument is, I know all that you can't really read all the things that are on these lines, but this is a line 1750, 1850, 1950. Looks a little bit like that population line that I showed you a little while ago. It's the same kind of thing. One of those lines is the population. One of those lines is extinctions. One of those lines is CO2. One of those lines is poisons. One of those lines is genetic damage. One of those lines is the complete and rapid diminution in male fertility that's gone on in the last 40 years. Didn't know if you knew that, but guys, fatherhood's going to get tougher and tougher. All of those things are changing. And all of those things are changing the way the world is. And all of those things feed into how slavery might be played out. And I'll tell you the truth, while I am a highly optimistic emancipationist abolitionist, I believe we can bring slavery to an end. My one worry is that we won't get ahead of this curve. That 30 years from now, the situation on the planet will be so seriously dire that slavery will become a non-issue. It just won't matter. Everything will be much worse. I don't think that's the worst case scenario. And I'm a happy kind of guy, so we're not going to talk about that. Yeah. But we're trying to understand, how does this fit? How does slavery, we know that slavery contributes to these anthropocentric changes, like deforestation. But how will it fit with the rest of it? There's also something that's this is a new book. You'll see I wrote it with one of my graduate students. If you're interested in the relationship between slavery and technology and how new slaveries and new technologies are arising together, I'm not sure if you can buy this because we just finished it, and I just saw my first paper copy in a photo 2 days ago. But we're analyzing the links between technological change and today, and how, for example, people who want to lure you into slavery can use your cell phone or even Facebook to get you into slavery. Why am I going on and on about science? Why am I going on about all these scientific breakthroughs? Because when this current anti-slavery movement got started in the 1990s, it was very emotional. It was very simplistic. It was very disparate. It was all about rescuing victims. It was all about being white saviors, swooping in and saving people. It was all about emotional reactions and not about thinking and planning and digging and using logic and using science. If we're going to solve this problem, we have to understand it's really complex. That cutting down trees has a role in putting people into slavery. That eating shrimp that costs a ridiculously cheap amount has a role in both cutting down trees and putting people into slavery. That our consumption habits can feed this, which also causes that, and the circles go round and round. And we have to determine as best we can if we want them to turn in vicious cycles or virtuous circles, go the other way. The other thing, though, that why we can be optimistic about that is this. Slavery today seems almost insurmountable. 40 million people in the world, 150 billion. But we saw it's actually a small country. In fact, and here's the key thing I want you to think about and take away, slavery, the number of people in slavery today is the smallest fraction, the tiniest fraction of the global population to ever be enslaved. Out of 7.6 billion people on the planet, 40 million people in slavery is the tiniest part of our world to ever be in slavery. And the $150 billion in the global economy that slavery puts out in a global economy of something like 12 to 14 trillion is literally like a drop in the ocean. It's so small that if we could magically stop all slavery tomorrow, you would not notice it economically, except unless you were a slaveholder. It would be a bad day for slaveholders. But in terms of the price of nothing would go up, no economy would collapse, no industry would collapse, except possibly some illegal commercial sexual exploitation industries. None of you would notice. It's a tiny problem, which in fact, even though it seems horrifically large, we have pushed it to the very edges. It's illegal in every country. It's against the law in every country. Every church and religious group, except for crazy ones like ISIS and the Tricosies and the Lord's Resistance Army, have rejected it. Virtually every human being thinks it's a horrible idea. We've pushed it to the very edges of our world society, into the dirty little corners. Slavery is standing on the edge of its own extinction if we give it a good hard push. We actually know how much that costs. We know how much it would take to get most of the people in the world out of slavery. Look at this chap for a second. This is a slaveholder who my friend Supriya pretended to be a journalist and got him to show off his rock quarry, but he was also showing off his families that he owned, that he had inherited from his father, because this is hereditary slavery in northern India. He owns all those people in the quarry, all the children, all of them. His father had owned their families, his grandfather had owned their families, and so forth. This is what it looks like after those families were set free. The forest behind that quarry was a protected national forest. And when those villagers came to freedom, one of the things that they said was, especially the women, said, our grandmothers told us when there were trees here, not just rocks, not just barren land. They told us about the forest. They said how we could find fruit in the forest. We could find fodder for our animals in the forest. How we could use the wood from the forest to make furniture and to burn fires. And, it was amazing to live in a forest. And when they came to freedom, they asked, could you help us replant the forest? So that was the first day. That little boy carrying the first tree was carrying it out to start the replanting of the forest. We were able to get the World Bank, in fact, to give us more than 100,000 trees for this village to begin replanting the forest. And I finish on this chap right here because he's the forest ranger. He was the forest ranger that was there when the criminals were there controlling them and cutting down the trees. And I was surprised about that they'd kept him on. And I said, why are you keeping the forest ranger? He was working with the criminals. And they said, he's just a poor kid from the same area. He didn't have any more control over the world than we did. Well, a little more because he wasn't in slavery, but he said that, the thugs who ran us controlled him too. So we said, you can stay, but you work for us. Now you work for us. And you're going to protect our trees. And if you don't, you can get another job. Like that. Okay. That's the key thing that I wanted to tell you about slavery tonight. I want to put this little point up about a new master's degree that we have that's online, but we can talk about that later. I thank you so very much for your kind attention.
If there are questions, raise your hand and we'll bring you along.
Good. Hi.
Hi, my name's Emma. Why is the cost of a slave gone down so much, like disproportionately?
Supply and demand. What is the rule? What happens if you glut any market with any product? The price collapses. That's a basic rule of economics. So the number of people in the world who are vulnerable and available to be enslaved has risen with the population explosion. It's not billions. Our best estimate of the vulnerable part of the human population that's in a situation where they could be enslaved pretty easily, the highly vulnerable part of the global population is probably something around 400 to 600 million people that could be easily enslaved. So they're cheap to acquire, right? There's so many of them, you can just go out and harvest them in. The interesting point there, almost an optimistic point, is if there's 400 million people who could be enslaved, it's only 40 million that are enslaved. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure. What's another question? And there's a chap in the back as well. I see a hand in the back. Back over that side. Hi.
Hi, my name is Sandy, and I've done a lot of research on PTSD and our kids with autism.
Mm-hmm.
And the functional MRIs of their brains are very similar to the ones that you showed.
Oh, now listen, I do have to say, those were just example ones. Those were not MRIs of people in slavery. But they might have, I don't know where they came from precisely, so they could have been what you're talking about.
But there is a lot.
Speaking to the mic.
I'm sorry. There is a lot of changes in, they've been finding out in our veterans with PTSD.
Oh, yes.
And our children with autism.
Wow.
Have a lot of those functional brain differences as well. And I know that one of the universities in Louisiana has been making enormous strides with helping translate that into a way to help, whether it's through medication or therapy.
Exactly.
They've been doing very well with that.
Veterans we know about, right? And veterans tend to have what's called simple PTSD. In other words, they've been in a situation like a bomb going off. There's another type, there's the other side of PTSD, which is called complex, which tend to be people who have been through long-term trauma, like sometimes children who've been abused over and over, and definitely slaves. But soon we'll be able to look at the same types of pictures. So, the veterans hospitals here can look at those MRIs of veterans and say, the right therapeutic approach through medicines and through other ways is this. We'll be able to do that for people in slavery. There was a hand in the, oh, there we go, go. Yeah.
I really don't know how to ask my question right. I'm so glad you're here, and I really enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
I have lost all my Facebook friends because, you watch the media, and I'm a media person, so, I'm not blaming them, but everybody's terrified about the sex slavery and human trafficking in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And I say it doesn't exist in the United States. In Africa, it used to be in Eastern European areas, things like that. It's not here. And they said, well, why does everybody believe that? And I said, it's because governments and funders are encouraging people to believe that because it puts money in police departments, it puts it in other places so that they can say, we're fighting human trafficking, which doesn't exist. And they go, great. What is the way to fight it in the United States? I mean, I know there is some. I know we need to do better. Where do we put the money, and how do we convince people to do it right?
That's a great question. But it's definitely here. It is definitely here. We don't have a very good number for the United States, mainly because government departments refuse to cooperate with each other and share data. We could do a calculation called multiple systems estimation, which we've done in Great Britain, which has given Great Britain a precise number of how many people should be in slavery in that country, according to the data that we've got. We could do that for the United States very easily. We could do it for the state of Mississippi very easily. But getting people to share the simple list that you need to do that doesn't exist. The reason I'm focusing on that data question and that number question is when I talk to politicians at a state house or in Congress or in other countries, they say, well, how can I plan? First, how can I plan the resources I need to do what you're asking? How many police do I need? How many programs do I need? If you can't tell me a straight answer about how big the problem really is. We've now cracked that. We know how many in England, we know how many in the Netherlands, France, Spain, Poland, lots of countries. We use random sample surveys in the developing world, where they work. They won't work in rich countries like this, but we still don't know what it is in the United States. I think if we just started with some number like 100,000, which I think would be minimum in the United States, that would be a start. The interesting thing is that we actually know some really good ways to do it in the United States. We know that a task force model where you bring NGOs together with law enforcement, media, churches, everything in a community or a county and get them all practicing, like pretending that a slavery case has just come up or a slavery case, that get them working together to how they would immediately respond, like a first responder team if it was a tornado. We know that if you do that practice, when they start finding the cases, they deal with them well, and they find them, right? We know that in places like where I come from, we now have Nottingham has now declared itself a slave-free city. Well, what does that mean? Could Hattiesburg be a slave-free city? Could Southern Miss be a slave-free university? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it could be the first one in the whole country. What it means is that everybody in the student body learns what it would look like if you saw someone in slavery. You would learn the warning signs. You would learn how not to buy things that are most likely to have slavery in them. You would make sure that all your Southern Miss shirts actually come from places where they can at least say there's no slave-made cotton, because you can get slave-free jeans. These are slave-free jeans. They're also child labor-free and a bunch of other stuff. I love them. And I bought them, look good, so I'm good, right? So I'm not turning around. I'm not turning around, girl. I'm not. Okay, but the point is, we actually have a lot of good ways to move forward. And that book that I wrote with Ron along quite a few years ago, The Slave Next Door, had a whole bunch of things in it about how you could work it through. But part of it's about political will, and because slaves don't vote, and there's not a lot of votes in being against slavery. And it takes leaders in politics to make that happen. People who are absolutely committed to bringing an end to slavery, and that takes a bit of smarts. And we're moving along nicely, but I have to say the political chaos that's occurring in this country, like the political chaos that's occurring in Brazil, means that all of their issues get pushed to the side. And that's what's happening in this country as well. The work of the national government here has pretty much stopped. Appointments haven't been made. Jobs are left empty in the anti-trafficking world. in the government. So it's all just slowing down. People have to focus on it, and they have to say to their politicians, this would be a good time to do it when they're trying to get your vote. Say, so what are you doing, right, to help us stop this problem? What's another question? Oh yeah, well there's a bunch of different websites if you want to find slave-free stuff. There's also a really good website called Slavery Footprint, which will tell you how many slaves work for you today. Yes.
Oh, I'd like to thank you for coming today.
Oh, yeah.
I was in the class that you attended.
I know you
and
do.
You answered
I
my
saw you.
question.
Yeah, I saw
I
you
was wondering
there.
if you could answer for everybody
You sat on
else
the front
too.
row. It's hard to miss you.
I was wondering if you
And
could
he does
answer
it. You
this.
did it again now. You're one of those front row people.
I don't know what's wrong with my voice. I usually talk much deeper.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could answer the question again about the slave chocolate issue in like the cocoa plants in the world.
Yeah, you asked that before, and it took like half an hour to answer.
Could you shorten that?
I can try to shorten it. We were talking about slavery in cocoa and chocolate. There's been a focus by a number of irresponsible NGOs in this country that have gone on and on about small children in slave plantations growing cocoa that go into your Easter bunnies. I actually was part of the team that exposed slavery in chocolate. So when we found it in the year 2002 in the Ivory Coast, we found it. We didn't find small children. We found young adults. We found young adult migrant laborers from Burkina Faso and Mali who had been enslaved in little tiny family farms. The places that they keep talking about slave plantations with little kids on them, there are no plantations in West Africa. There are 1.4 million tiny family farms. None of them get over 10 acres. And they're families. And a few of them hire people in, and a tiny percentage, like 1%, enslave young men from other countries who are migrants, and they enslave them. So it's actually a strange situation in which the moral panic created by some unscrupulous but well-meaning NGOs, Stop the Traffic was one of them, Not for Sale was one of them, that said, we're freaking out because all these, and they put out false stuff, led to a civil war in the Ivory Coast, which stopped any anti-slavery work for a while, and also completely diverted the attention and the energy and the efforts. Now, saner heads did prevail, and now all chocolate companies in the United States have been forced by a kind of political trick to work together, and they put millions and millions of dollars every year into West Africa, but they don't put it. They have to hand it over to a different organization called the International Cocoa Initiative that's based in Geneva, but is run by anti-slavery and anti-child labor experts who goes to local people who know exactly what to do, and they stop the slavery that does exist in the villages. And they're slowly working through all the villages, and I think in another 8 to 10 years, we may actually see the end of any kind of forced labor in cocoa, which would be great. And in the meantime, buy fair trade. There's plenty of slave-free cocoa and chocolate out there now. But don't get too worked up about it, because it's actually a smallish question in the zone. Yes, ma'am. Quick, Mike. Or you can just tell me and I can repeat it. Oh, okay, you're there.
Okay. I'm actually Lily Bush. I'm one of the interns with the center. And I have a question. When you were telling the stories of the slaves who were freed, how do you, like, for lack of better words, explain to them what you're trying to do? Like, are they eager to tell their stories? Or, like, I don't know if that question makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's a good question, and it's a sympathetic question that you're asking. It's an empathetic question that you're asking. It's the right kind of question. But I also have to say the question actually belies a slight need for an attitude shift in you and in me and on all of us, right? Because one of the biggest problems that survivors of slavery have is that people talk about them as if they're like trained dogs. Like, how do I explain something to them so that they can understand they're smart. If they've survived slavery, they're tough. Look, think about Frederick Douglass. Read his work. The man was a genius. He came out of terrible slavery, and he became a literary masterpiece and a movement leader and one of the great thinkers of Middle America. The people that I know who have come out of slavery are just like you. They're just like me. They've just had something really bad happen to them. But that isn't who they are. And that's what is a very important. That's why I never use the word victim. Because they say to me, why do people keep calling me a victim? Like, I was a victim of a crime once, but that's not who I am. I'm a computer programmer. I'm a mother. I'm a girlfriend. I'm a boyfriend, right? I'm a student. I'm a scholar. And we have to just get over this idea that they are somehow pathetic individuals that need our help. We need their help. They do need our help, in the same that all of us need help from each other. But we also need their help a lot. I'm very happy that one of the key things that we've been very supportive of in our rights lab is the Global Survivors Alliance. There's now, you can go online and see the Survivor Alliance, but it's an only survivors, all the time organization, only for survivors, by survivors. And they're all working together. They're getting each other jobs. They're sorting things out. One thing they're saying is, hey, survivors, you don't have to go out and tell a bunch of people your story for free. You don't have to listen to their stupid questions. If you want to go and charge them. The other day, I'm just last little bit on this. I feel very strongly, but it's fascinating to me. The other day, we had at our university an event like this. It was just like this. Only we had two survivors. Both of them were American, Shamir McKenzie and Min Dang, of extensive enslavement. And they set up and talked to each other. They had a dialogue between the two of them. And the thing that shocked all the students that were in a big hall like this was they started asking each other questions that people in audiences often feel they have a right to ask them. Like, so, Shamir, have you forgiven all those men that raped you? So, men, since you were used for sex for so long, can you actually have intimate relations? Okay, now wait. Who didn't cringe, right? Who did not cringe when I asked those questions? But that, one of the things that we do when we separate survivors out and treat them as some sort of moral, pathetic objects is somehow, it's almost like they're dogs. You can just ask them, you can say anything about them, ask them anything. And they were asking each other those questions and shocking the students because they wanted to say, would you ask that of your friend? Would you ask that of your sister? Maybe if you got way deep with them and it was the right moment. But they were helping us to understand that you can't do that. You got to get past this idea that they're somehow anything different to you, except that they had this experience that you haven't had. And you've had experiences that they have. Thank you for that question. That was really excellent. Did you know I was going to dump on you like that? Anyway, what's another question? Yeah.
I can't think of an example at the moment, but
Wait, you kind of went in and out.
I can think of an example at the moment, but what is the global community doing to against governments that unofficially hold up their slave economy?
Yeah, that's a good question. The one little problem with your question is the phrase "the global community." That kind of implies that there's any kind of common community of the nations around the world that don't hate each other and want to fight all the time. Okay. So one of the problems right there is that we have a very broken up global community. But where you're really going with that question, and I appreciate this very much, is you're really talking about what's called state-sponsored slavery. In the world today, there is a lot, not the biggest amount of slavery, but a significant amount of slavery in the world is state-sponsored slavery. So if we go to the country of Uzbekistan, this will ring some bells in Mississippi. If you go to the country of Uzbekistan, their one cash crop is cotton. So what happens at harvest time? They empty all the schools and universities pretty much at gunpoint. You have to go and pick the cotton. Every student in the entire country is, unless you belong to your dad's the governor or something, you don't have to go. Every kid in the whole country, teenagers and college students, have to go. And they have to go into the fields and they have to pick cotton and work like dogs for like 2 or 3 months to get the whole cotton harvest in because that's the cash crop of the country. Do they get paid? No. They get paid, they got food. That's exactly what happened in Mississippi in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Harvest time just passed. was a time when the black schools closed in Mississippi. Not the white schools, just the black schools. And they were closed so that all the kids could be put into the fields to pick the cotton. That was a kind of state-sponsored, Mississippi state-sponsored slavery, pretty darn close. In Uzbekistan, definitely, because it's the national government making it happen. In China, people who are sent to prison but without due process, no trial, no charges, they end up in prison, but the prison is a factory, and the factory was, well, 2 months ago, those factories were making all the stuff you're buying now for Halloween, for example. There's a lot of state-sponsored slavery. The implication of your question, if I may be so bold, is what's going on in this country. What about we've all seen 13. We all understand what's going on in the prison systems. And I cannot prove, even though it looks and smells like slavery, we have yet to be able, to my knowledge, to prove in absolute legal clarity the linkage of every bit of the legal system that leads to forced labor, that people are cognizant that they're actually participating in a system of state-sponsored enslavement. Why haven't we been able to prove that? Because when you turn your prisons over to corporations, they become invisible. State institutions are required to open up and have open government. We're supposed to be able to look at the files and stuff in state governments. The corporations are protected. So when you try to go to a prison and find out what's actually going on there in terms of the workers, they say, we're sorry, this is a corporation, this is a business. We have privacy that you can't violate. And of course, the people who might be in that situation of actually supplying people down the line through plea bargaining, through differential arrest patterns and so forth, into a system which is now turned into something that really looks like the Chinese prison system, they're not talking either. I think there's a bunch of investigative journalists and lawyers out there who are going to crack this wide open. And I think when they do, the world, the United Nations, is going to condemn the United States for letting itself drift down into a state prison system. And I'm ashamed about that as a person born in this country. But I got to tell you, as somebody who's looked at state-sponsored slavery around the world in different countries and been in the middle of it in places like Eastern Congo, I can't say there's slavery in the American system yet, but I can tell you this: it walks like a duck, it swims like a duck, it honks like a duck, it flies. If that's not slavery and we're going to prove it out in time, I'll be amazed. I'll be amazed.
One more question?
Yes.
Okay, I had just a quick question. You mentioned the Netherlands, and that made me think about, I know this is kind of a hot topic, but like the legalization of sex work and how that affects the prevalence of trafficking or like human slavery in certain countries.
Okay, sure. Now, did you say the legalization or the illegalization?
The legalization.
So you're talking about this idea that some people say, if we're going to protect people who are caught up in commercial sexual exploitation, I don't call it sex work. I call it, let's call it what it is, commercial sexual exploitation. Will that help it if we legalize it? Now that's an argument that has been won in the Netherlands and in Germany, right? And in Australia, one state of Australia. They said, we're going to protect the women who are selling their bodies, selling sex, by regulating it, making sure they have health checks, protections, they can call the police if they need to, and so forth. And it helped a few women, and it made a lot of things worse, is what the data shows. But it is controversial, and it's so controversial that you even have researchers who are not interested in the truth of what's going on and actually just fight over and try to prove things. It really gets into this false fact stuff, this fake news stuff. I've done my best to try to get to the bottom of most of this. What I've discovered is that any place you legalize commercial sexual exploitation, you create a black market. So you can go to Amsterdam and you can buy, let's call it vanilla sex, right? Standard sort of sex. Or you can buy some funny, kinky stuff where you get whipped or something like that. And that's all legal. Sorry, that's too racy? Okay, right? So you can buy that. But the thing is, you create a market where people expect to be able to purchase what they want. And you also create a market where, we all started on vanilla ice cream, but later, double chocolate, fudge toffee, whatever, right? The point is, men being what they are, they always want more, bigger, better, different, right? Different, especially, exotic. So in Amsterdam, yeah, you got control over those ones. But you go around the back into the alleys, if you've decided, I've had enough with doing this with grown women, I want to do it with little girls. There's a place in the back with little girls. It's illegal. It's not regulated. It's not watched out for. If the police find it, they'll bust it. But you created a zone where that's for sale, and everybody understands that that's how you do it. Now, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and other places, they've created a different law completely, which is that they make it legal for a woman primarily to sell sex, but illegal for a man to buy it. I know, you just went, huh? Right? The woman can sell it, but the man can't buy it. Because they said, for all of human history, the power balance between men and women when it comes to buying sex has always been with the men. The men have the money, the physical power, the political power, the cultural power. And the women just have to sell what they've got when they've got nothing. This at least gives the women the power to call the police if the man does anything they don't like. Right? So this is a change. Is that better? I think it's better. Is it good enough? No. I think it's a halfway step. I personally, and this is my personal thing in this whole politicized and ideological thing, I want to live in a world without, I want to live in a world without slavery, and I want to live in a world where people don't feel they have to sell their bodies to make it, right? And I don't see, and I think it's a terrible thing that people have to sell their, and I have to say, in my work, I've met maybe 100 people who sell their bodies, men, women, children, have had to sell their bodies, and I have not found a single one of those people that I did not personally, and again, personal view, that I did not personally feel had been damaged by being involved in that. I don't think we want to damage people like that. I'm sure I have met one person who sold her body that was not damaged. She was a physical therapist who worked with extremely disabled people, and in Holland, typical Holland, right? And she realized that her clients had never had sex, they would never have a chance to have sex, because they were incredibly disabled, and she decided to say to them, as your physical therapist, I will work with you in that way too. And some of them said yes, and some of them said no. But that's the only person I met who did not seem damaged by, in a sense, providing that therapy. Right. Does that help at all? It is a complex issue, and it's one we've got to get to grips with. And I think really women need to have a lot more to say about this. Because there's not that many men selling their bodies. There's some, but it's really about men's control of women and the wholesale of women. Yeah. Oh. You guys are great. So do I just bless them and send them home now? You may go.